They can't find the money. That's my guess. They don't know where it is. They don't know where $43 billion went. And they need to know where that money went. Otherwise, this war doesn't end. The regime in Iran, which was Iran's political system for 47 years, that regime was not a friend to its people. It was an enemy to its own people. That regime was a corrupt government that impoverished its own citizens, that was cruel to them, disastrously cruel, executed them, destroyed lives, destroyed families. It was not a good government. It was not a good regime. It did not help its people. It did not help its country. Everything that regime did was about preserving itself, protecting its own power, and protecting itself from anything or anyone that might undermine it. And that could have been the people of Iran, but the regime managed then over decades to completely impoverish and disempower its own people, that its people were no longer the biggest existential threat to the regime. They weren't in a position where they were economically or even psychologically empowered enough to have been able to overthrow this government or have been able to withstand or resist what the government was doing to its own people over years, over decades. The greatest threat to the Iranian government came from outside the country. They were foreign governments. They were countries like Iraq. They were leaders like Saddam Hussein. And that was also the United States. The United States is and has always been one of the greatest threats to the Iranian regime because, as we can see now, the US has the power to bomb that country, to declare war on this country, to topple the government, to free the people, which is exactly what has happened. So however you want to see the war, that is still what the US will say that it's doing, and it has done the job. It has done the job. What people are wondering, and what you should be asking, the reason why you might feel deceived or the reason why you might not agree with this war, is because when you look at their own objective, when they say the objective of this war was to take out the leadership, the regime's leadership, free the people, give the country back to its people. What happened then was that the US then continued to bomb the country. There's been 10,000 bombs that have been dropped on Iran, and no one knows why, because this war has continued for 3 weeks, even though the leadership was taken out in the first hit, on the first day, in the first hour of the war. So why was that not enough? There are 2 questions, which is one, why did the US keep going after that? But the second question is, if they were going to do such a stealth operation, take out the leadership in one hit, they executed that perfectly. It was a very clean job. Why was that not just a sting operation? Why could they not have just done that covertly? Why has this been playing out on the media, on the news? Why is the US Secretary of War coming out and giving a statement to the press every single day? Why is that happening? Why has this become such a huge charade or a huge kind of theater being acted out in front of cameras with the input of all governments around the world? Why are they doing that? And the answer is, this war is still part of Operation Epic Fury, and Operation Epic Fury is still part of the US strategy with Iran of maximum pressure. The strategy of maximum pressure, that includes the sanctions, the economic sanctions that have been put on Iran for decades. It includes the decision to decouple Iran from the US dollar, so to take Iran off the banking system, off the global currency system. That was part of the decision to economically isolate Iran. Why? To apply maximum pressure. Maximum pressure for what? What is it that they are trying to achieve? Why do they need to pressure that regime? It's because they want something. They want something from the regime, which is why they are applying pressure as much as they can. And when you see what is happening now, that they are escalating, they have only escalated this war, even though they took out the regime leadership at the beginning. They have continued bombing the country, they have escalated their attacks, and they are declaring this to the world. They are letting it play out everywhere. So the US Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, he came out a few days ago, delivered a speech to a room full of shocked journalists about how the US had more or less already defeated this country. that they had no weapons left, they had no military power, they had nothing left, but they were still hitting them as hard as they could, as hard as they could. He gave this speech to a room full of people who don't even understand why their country is at war and also don't understand what this military strategy is. Who is it that this strategy is supposed to be for? Who is it rescuing? But also, what you have to ask yourself is, who was that speech for? That speech is heavily coded. It is a heavily coded speech because when you hear it, he has threatening, menacing, intimidating language, which isn't necessary for the people sitting in that room. It's not necessary for American journalists covering this war. It's also not necessary for the people of Iran who don't have internet and will not hear that speech. So who was it for? Who was he addressing that speech to? That speech, like all of his speeches that he has given so far, that was a message. And the message was to the people who the US still considers to be their enemy. It was a message to the people who are still linked to the regime, who aren't in Iran, who are more than likely outside of Iran. The US, very obviously by this statement, they don't know where, they don't know who they are, and they don't know where the money is. Because what the regime did or has done over the last 47 years is not only rob its own population of what it owes them, it has also refused to collaborate, to partner, to trade, to cooperate with the US. Iran will trade with China. Iran will trade with all other countries, but Iran will not trade with the US. This is because the US has, in the past, proven that it will, if it is capable of it, siphon away their oil reserves and their money and not allow the Iranian government or the Iranian people to partake of their own wealth. And in an attempt to block the US from being able to do that, it nationalized its oil reserves. And you might think that that's a good move, and usually it would be. It's something that I think we should have done in Australia because we don't own, or the country, the people, the citizens, we don't own our natural resources. So all of our natural resources have been privatized. So we don't get the benefit of having natural gas or iron ore because only one person or one company gets the benefit. For example, Gina Rinehart has been made rich. She's the richest person in Australia because of iron ore, but that iron ore is in the ground. That belongs to the people. All the indigenous people of this country should be rich because of iron ore, and they're not. They're not. Only Gina Rinehart is. And that's the same with all of our natural resources. So what Iran did was they stopped that from happening. It can't be privatized. So their oil is not privatized. The oil belongs to the government. The oil belongs to the country of Iran, and it should technically belong to the people of Iran. But of course, it belongs to the government, and the government was corrupt, and that was the problem. So, where that money goes, the money from the oil, they trade with their oil, they sell the oil, and the money in exchange for the oil goes to trustees. It goes to trustees. And the thing is, those trustees, you would have assumed they are in Iran, that they're in the country. And you would also assume that the $43 billion that Iran made last year from selling oil, that money would also be somewhere in the country. But it's actually because of the US, because of the crippling economic sanctions put on Iran by the US, that no one in that country has money. Not even the government, not even the regime, because they couldn't. They weren't allowed to use US dollars. They weren't given US dollars. They could not trade with US dollars. What they had to trade in was gold. So what they have done over years is they have collected gold, they have bought gold, they have brought in gold from overseas, they have sold gold back to their population, and part of that gold it has kept. All of that oil has gone to China. China uses it, it collects it, it on-sells it. It has basically made a huge business out of that oil, as you would. It has not only stored plenty of reserves, so it is not in any short supply of Iran's oil. It has bought all of it. It has the oil, it sells to other countries, but also what China has done in order to pay for that oil, it has bought infrastructure in Iran. The oil refineries and the oil and gas plants, a lot of that infrastructure, which are very expensive to build, very expensive to maintain, that infrastructure is supposed to help the domestic economy. It's supposed to be helping the Iranian economy. It's supposed to be helping the Iranian people. But it is foreign owned. It is owned by foreign investors in China as a form of payment, because that infrastructure, even though they officially own it, it is still used by the people of Iran. So whoever it is that makes a profit out of using it, they get to keep the money. So it is a very corrupt way of using money that comes from overseas, where the money technically doesn't go to you, but you get the use out of the facility, you get the use out of that infrastructure without having to pay for it. China has become one of the biggest investors now in Iran and in the UAE, so in the Gulf states. It is now one of the biggest investors in the Middle East because it buys Iran's oil and it supports the infrastructure needed to maintain that relationship. So it has protected its trade route. It has already protected its trade route. It already has alternatives to using the Strait of Hormuz in cases like this when the US comes and tries to seize the strait. So China has already preempted the situation, has already prepared for it. What the government of Iran has been doing for the last 10, 20 years is, because it can't use US dollars, because it has these US sanctions that have been imposed on it, so it can't trade with the US, it has to find other trading partners. So it will find other trading partners, let's say in Asia or in Europe or in Southeast Asia. And when it sells its oil to these trading partners, it doesn't receive money through the US banking system. And that's because the US doesn't allow Iran to be part of the US banking system. It doesn't allow them to be part of the international financial system. So it has more or less created an entire parallel economy so that it can trade with its oil. And Iran is allowed to do that. It is allowed to sell its oil to any country that will buy it. So Iran is allowed to do that. It is allowed to trade its oil and it is allowed to receive payment for that oil. And because it can't receive payment in the form of an international transfer, it has had to come up with alternative ways. So this barter system that exists between China and Iran, they are trading in infrastructure. They are trading with roads and buildings and things that usually would take years to build up and years to buy and invest in. And those are terms that have just been negotiated between those two parties. Another way that they trade is they trade in gold and they trade in crypto, in China's digital currency. China and Russia also have a shared digital currency. It's a version of crypto, which is like an underground payment system that does not go through the international financial system. It doesn't have to. It is a digital currency, and they are able to trade that way. So they have created an entire system of being able to trade, of being able to make money, and for that money to be untraceable. It's untraceable. They can't trace gold or crypto, or they can't trace it. They can't trace it. And the problem, the biggest problem for the US and for Israel is that that money doesn't really make its way back to Iran. And if it makes its way back to Iran, it is funneled out again. They don't keep their wealth there. The wealth is sitting in places outside of that country, in bank accounts, foreign bank accounts, and it's left there to sit. And it's left there for long enough that that money generates interest in the millions.